Ladies and gentlemen, I am Harry Lausaneziris, and this is my grecochess YouTube channel. And we are going now in this and the two subsequent videos to talk about the chessanity tournament that took place yesterday, Sunday, June 8th at Jericho, New York. This video is about my game in round number 1, but before I start the game, let me share the announcement of the tournament. And here we are. You see, it took place June 8th at an elementary school in Jericho, New York. It consisted of 4 rated sections, USCF meaning United States Chess Federation rated sections. What does it mean? It means that players, depending on their rating, they could select their section. Players with rating below 2000 could participate in the U2000, below 1200 in the U1200, below 800 in the U800, and below 400 in the section U400. Having a rating of 1554, I was only allowed to participate in the U2000, and that's what I did. Time controls depend on the section. For my section, U2000, it is G50, D5, 3 rounds. This means I had to play 3 games, and in each game, at the beginning of the game, the players had 50 minutes on their clock. But in every move, for the first 5 seconds, the clock would not move. After that, the clock would start going downwards, and you'd better complete all of your moves before the clock went down to 0. The tournament started at 12:15, and at least for me, I had to play chess for almost 6 hours in a row because the games were quite long, and just a few minutes after the end of each game, the new game would start. Although it's not stated, but it's well known for tournaments, if your time reaches the 5:00, meaning if you have 5 or less minutes to play for the remaining of your moves, you don't need to record your moves. And this is fortunate because otherwise it takes too much time out of your precious few remaining minutes. And before we start game number 1, let's look at the photos of the place. How does it look like? This is the elementary school from the outside. You see the parking lot. The entrance is where I point the arrow, and to the left is the room where the games took place. How does it look from the inside? This is the cafeteria room. To be exact, this is half of the cafeteria room, but the other half looks exactly the same. And you're going to see that the boards and the clocks are set in advance by the organizers. In most US chess tournaments, players themselves have to bring their boards and clocks and have to set up the clocks. And sometimes it's not so simple, but here, thanks to the organizers, the players don't have to worry. The boards and the clocks are ready, and the clocks have been set up with the appropriate time controls. Organizers, thank you very much for what you're doing. And now we are going to go to round number 1. We're going to go to the chess.com screen. And let's go share my screen and go to chess.com. Here we are learn analysis. And we are starting the game. My opponent had white. My opponent did not want to share his name, and I'm respecting his wish, and that's why he's only going to be identified as my opponent, and I'm not going to show any information related to him. But I need to tell everyone that in the tournament, I was the highest rated player. There was a total of 14 players competing in the U2000 section, which is a record number for this tournament. According to the numbers, I'm supposed to be the favorite, but in reality, I had so many unpleasant experiences in the past. I was rated the best, and I ended up being at the very bottom with 0 losses. With 0 wins and 3 losses. That is why being ahead in rating doesn't mean necessarily too much. But let's see what happened in round number 1 with my opponent starting the e-pawn, replying with the so-called French defense. Opponent plays his pawn to d4. Here you see on the right what does the computer think about its move. For time being, I'm still in theory, that's why you're going to see it's a book move. My opponent places his bishop d3. In the opening, players try to develop their pieces and control as much as possible the center and make sure the king is safe. Develop my knight, but now my knight is attacked, and my knight will go to d7 to avoid the attack. My opponent will develop his knight from g1 to e2, and I'm going to place my pawn from c7 to c5 to get some space on the queen side. It seems that we're not in theory any longer. The computer thinks my move is the best, but it's not a book move any longer. Opponent places his pawn to c3. Great move for the computer. I place my knight to c6. And my opponent little by little starts building an advantage. You see the 0.87. If it's a plus, it means that white has advantage. If it's minus, it means that black has the advantage. And now my opponent will place his pawn to a3. Although it's not considered as theory, you see that these are the best moves, and usually good players know them by heart. I'm going to take the d4 pawn. Why? Because I'm constraining space. Little by little, my opponent is taking more and more of the space, and I need a little bit more space for my pieces. If my opponent can take even more of the space, my pieces have nowhere to go. They are attacked and they are lost. So we exchange now the c pawns at d4. I develop my bishop. My bishop can only go to e7, as you may see, my dark color bishop. My opponent castles and has already more than a pawn advantage, ahead by more than a pawn. And I'm going now to push my pawn from b7 to b6. Why? To give some space to my light color bishop that until now could not move at all. My opponent will continue expanding with the f pawn to f4, and I place my bishop to b7. But as I do so, my moves are not always the best, and my opponent's advantage starts becoming larger and larger. My opponent now will place his pawn to f5, try to shrink me even more. I need some space now, so I'm going to take the pawn at a5, f5, excuse me. My opponent will take now the same pawn, in fact, not the same pawn, but at the same square, the pawn the same square, f5. It has an advantage of 2 pawns, quite significant for so early. Now I'm going to place my bishop to a6. Why? I want to attack the knight. If the knight moves, I'm taking the rook and win an exchange, and the knight is protected only by the queen. And for the time being, this means that the queen is constrained. My opponent develops the knight to c3. I take my opponent's knight, he takes it back with his knight. At this point, his advantage becomes quite large, 3.57, meaning more than a minor piece. And it seems that things are going to go his way, but let's see what actually happened. I'm going to castle now, at least put my king in safety. Now I'm 4 pawns down, almost a rook, but let's see what will happen. And my opponent now is going to move the knight from e2 to f4. You're going to see here on your left, the computer believes it's a blunder, and the advantage switches from 4 pawns to almost 0, barely being ahead. And I'd like to ask the viewers to please pause your video and see why this move is a blunder, because it's not very obvious. At that moment, I saw it at once, but of course I spent some time double checking, because even if something you think you see it at once, better double check to make sure no surprises. Hopefully you took some time and you found what is the problem, and I'm going to show to you. Knight goes from c6 to from c6, yes, to d4, and I take the pawn. And some of you may be wondering, are you crazy? You're going to lose your knight. And all this just for a pawn, even though it's a central pawn, it's less valuable than a knight. And my opponent, with a smile on his face, he grabs his queen and is ready to land it on d4. And then, just before he landed it, his smile disappeared. Instead, tears started coming out of his eyes. He hesitated. His queen was above, hanging in the air. And the problem is not only if he takes my knights, something terrible will happen, but also his bishop is under attack, meaning if he puts his queen somewhere irrelevant, for example, e1 or whatever, I'm grabbing his bishop. And now I'm going to explain to you what is the problem if my opponent takes a knight at d4. There is an expression, never look a gift horse in the mouth, which means if you get something for free, don't worry if its quality is low. In any case, you got more than what you paid for. But in chess, sometimes you really need to look a gift horse in the mouth, because then you'll see that if he takes it, bishop goes to c5, queen is pinned, cannot move because it's in the diagonal of the queen, and next move, I grab the queen. That is my opponent, instead of grabbing the knight at d4 with such a smile, he lands his queen on d3. Now he's a pawn behind. But more than that, he has lost a pawn in material. The computer thinks even that is not the best move, and is down minus 183 from +4 to minus 183 in just one move. That shows how cruel chess can be. One little careless moment and everything disappears. Myself, I have an extra pawn. I don't know that's minus 183, but I know in material I have one extra pawn. You count them. I have 6, my opponent has 5. So what should we do? Simplify. Exchange pieces as many as possible, because every piece you exchange is one less piece you might eventually blunder, and hopefully arrive in a winning ending. So I take the bishop, or it takes my knight. Let's continue. Where we are now? Now, yes, I exchange a piece, but the queen is very near my king. I don't want my queen to be there, because if for any reason can control the h7 square, fortunately there is no light colored bishop, but perhaps the knight or who knows how, then it could easily be a mate. So let's make sure that we are away from the scenario, and let's ask the queen to go away. Yes, I slightly weaken the formation of my king with one pawn move, but I don't have to worry about a queen ready to checkmate, at least not immediately. Queen will go, of course, to d3. And now it's time to exchange even more. I grab a second pawn to a5. Now I have 2 pawns, but it's not going to last for too long, because my opponent will take back one of the 2 pawns with a queen, and then we exchange queens. By exchanging queens, I know that it's impossible to blunder my queen any longer. You never know what will happen, really. No matter how much ahead you are, you can easily blunder a piece when you least expect it, and that's why if you're ahead, better exchange material. Now my bishop at e7 is attacked. Not only that, it's not in a good position, not too many things to do. If I bring my rook to e8, knight goes to c7, and forks my 2 rooks. f6, g5, it's lost. h4, the pawn at g3 will throw it away. Goes back to d8, it's safe for now, but stops the collaboration of the 2 rooks, so the one rook cannot protect the other. b4 cannot go, 2 squares only, c5 and d6, but c5 is good because it comes with a check. Check means that for the next move, my opponent must reply to the check and cannot continue threatening. King goes to h1. Knight goes to d3. Why? I'm attacking the bishop. I want to exchange as much as possible. And if bishop decides to go somewhere irrelevant, for example, h6, or h6, I have to worry about my rook, but let's say g5 or something like that, I can check with my knight at f2, and my opponent either needs to take with the rook and lose in exchange, or bring the king to g1, and then my knight at f2 can do what's called the discover check, which can be quite dangerous. What does my opponent do now? My opponent decides to reply with a check, f6. Only two legal moves. And you may see here that the g7 is so much better than h8, although both keep me ahead. I'd rather put in g7 because my opponent has to worry about his knight. Knight goes to g4. And at that time, I was thinking to, for example, push a pawn at h5 or do something like that and kick the knight away. But then, just before I played this move, I realized that if I played anything like that, bishop goes to h6, check, and there is what's called an X-ray or a skewer, and my rook at f8 is lost. And that is why, instead of doing anything like that, let's continue the exchanges. Yes, the bishop at c1 has not moved at all. It will, and while my knight is at a very nice square, but I'm ahead and I don't want any surprises, so let's exchange the bishops. So now this skewer is not possible any longer. Now my two rooks, what should I do? Theory says develop your least well-placed pieces, which in this case are my rooks. My bishop is a nice square near the center. My rooks are hidden at the 8th rank, and even worse, they have pawns in front of them and cannot move. So let's bring them ideally to the open D and 8 files. First, the rook from F8 goes to E8. You may wonder, who cares which rook you move first? You'll see later it is important. Because my opponent decides to attack my bishop, have me to think where to put my bishop. Anywhere it goes can be attacked, but fortunately, by moving my rook from f8 to e8, I give a square to my bishop, and here it is safe. Although it doesn't do anything, at least for now, it is safe. Knight goes to g6, threatens my rook. So my rook cannot stay in e8 and have the other one at d8. And my rook goes to c8. Because I want to encourage the exchange of rooks. I want to exchange as much material as possible and reach an ending with an extra pawn, exchange pawns, have a pass pawn, promote, and win. This is the summary of my plan. My opponent decides to place his knight from f6 to d5. He cannot allow just rooks to be exchanged because then his knight on f6 is going to be lost. He puts his knight on d5, exactly the center, a nice square, even though the computer thinks a mistake. And for me, exchange the rooks, increasing my advantage. Now each side, in addition to the kings, we have one rook. My opponent has to worry, especially after the check where he places his king on h1, about a back rank mate. Not yet, because my rook on h8 is not doing too many things. But if he's not careful, this could happen. And I have bishop versus knight, which is an advantage in an open field like here, and I have an extra pawn. I'm going to attack his knight by moving my rook from a8 to d8. Now, my opponent has to start thinking about back rank. My opponent perhaps could put his rook on d1 and hope that I would do something crazy, like put my thing on g8, because the knight checks, and after the check, I lose my rook. That's what I was thinking about while my opponent was contemplating his move, how to reply if my opponent would put his rook on d1. But that's not what my opponent did. My opponent decided to move his knight to save it because it had either to move the knight or put the rook on d1. It went to f4. My rook now goes to d7. I want to avoid his rook landing on c7 and even threatening a fork if he placed on c6. Now it's not possible because of the back rank issue, but it could be later on. My opponent solves the back rank issue by moving the pawn from g2 to g3. Once again, keep f7 under control and develop my least well-placed piece, my bishop on f8, send it to e7, protected by the rook, and starting and having more control of the board. My opponent will place his rook from c1 to e1 in order to constrain my rook. It cannot leave the 7th rank. Bishop goes to f6. What is the goal? First of all, it controls a long diagonal. This diagonal And these are the two long ones, and if you have a bishop, it's great if you can control them. But also I want to go to b2 and threaten the pawn at a3. My opponent cannot put the rook on a1 to defend it because the bishop will take it. Instead, put it on b1, so my bishop cannot go to b2. Since my plan, the bishop cannot continue, I develop, in fact, I improve the position of my rook, sending it to d2. Second rank. The advantage is the king cannot move, definitely can, even if his pawn was not, he cannot go to g2, cannot leave the first rank, and he cannot even leave the h1. Can go to g1 maybe, but if it goes to f1, the pawn at h2 is lost. So this constrains my opponent. The opponent now decides to save the pawn at a3 even more effectively by moving the rook to b3 and perhaps making the rook more active. And now I want to start pushing the pawns and threatening my pawn's pieces. Pawn goes from g6 to g5. Inaccuracy, the computer says, and I realized it after I played it. Fortunately, it's not a crucial error. It's not a good move, but it's not going to destroy the game for me. And then I saw what my opponent could do, and that's what my opponent did. Check with the knight. And fortunately, I have only one square to go. The square at g6. If I had another piece of mine, a pawn or anything here, in fact, the pawn I couldn't because it would take the knight, but if I had, let's say, a knight, a rook, or anything here, or if my opponent had a bishop here controlling this square, then my king had to leave and I would lose my bishop. You see here that there's only one move that gives me the advantage. Any other move is going to put me well behind. And that's why I put my king on g6. My opponent now realizes his knight is in danger. Well, he can still help it protect with the pawn going to g4, but it's in a bad shape, so he decides to exchange. While he avoids losing his knight for free, it simplifies the position even more for me. That's what I want. Now we have only rooks, and I have an extra pawn. In many cases, if there are rook endings, even an extra pawn doesn't mean too much because one side with perpetual checks can achieve a draw. And that's what my opponent tried to do. Rook goes to f3, I go to e6, rook goes to e3, check, I go to d7. Rook goes to e5 to threaten the pawn at g5. You see, since I only have one extra pawn, it means that if my opponent, one way or the other, is able to get back the pawn, we're talking about a completely even endgame. But fortunately, I had the move from f7 to f6. You see, with my rook, I could not protect it because if the rook goes here to d5, it's lost. If it cannot go to g2 because both the king will take it and the pawn blocks it. But fortunately, the king cannot go. Fortunately, I had the pawn on f7 and goes to f6. Rook goes to f5 and threatens now the f6 pawn. King goes to e6 and attacks the rook. Rook goes back to f3. And I continue with my rook going from f6 to f5. At this point, you see that even though my last move was an inaccuracy, I'm 2.5 pawns ahead. And at this point, each of us had less than 5 minutes left. And that is why we stopped recording according to the rules. I'll just give you a summary of what happened. Later on, at some point, the rooks were exchanged. I was able to exchange enough pawns and promote my pawn and win the game. I would like to thank my opponent for the game, congratulate him. He played quite well. One crucial mistake decided the game. He tried very hard after that, any chance he saw. And of course, it's amazing how well he played the opening until this mistake. He was able to be 4 points ahead. These things happen. I don't want him to be depressed or disappointed because of that result. These things happen, and we all have faced such scenarios. But before we end today's program, let's look at the review. Let's see what does chess.com think about our performance. I had 86.4, my opponent 83.5. I had a performance of 2300. What does this mean? It means that if the computerchess.com had to play the game Guess the Elo, and based on this game, it would think that my rating is 2300. Thanks to SCOM, you're very flattering, and my opponent had 2200. Other than that, I had one brilliant move, and I think, let's go back. This was when my knight got the pawn, even though it would be taken by the queen. In great moves, 2 versus 1 for me, both of us had 15 best moves. Inaccuracies, 5 my opponent, 4 for me. We had both of us 4 book moves. Inaccuracies, 5 my opponent, 4 for me. Mistakes, I made 1, my opponent none. My opponent had 2 misses. Miss means when you had the great move and you don't see it. And no blunders from either side. That is what the game review is saying. And this concludes game number 1. I started the tournament with a win. I had 2 more games to play, and after a very brief break, I moved on to round number 2. How did round number 2 go, and how did round number 3? We're going to see later on the 2 next videos. Thanks for watching. Thanks for the subscribers. Thanks for the viewers. Ladies and gentlemen, see you later at the video of round number 2. Goodbye.